Hey folks, David Stewart here. Time for some more Storycraft. Today we are going to be talking about character growth or character arcs, whatever you want to call them. This is the presence in a story of a character, or in some cases multiple characters, who change throughout the course of the story. Usually into a better version of themselves, not into like a worse version of themselves. So you could do that. That usually doesn't feel very good, but they change into a better version of themselves, usually because there's something that is holding them back. There's some plot obstacle that they have to overcome by improving themselves. So that's something that is present in a lot of stories, but it is not required. So that's the first thing I want to get out of the way. You do not have to have character growth be part of your story. That is not a required story element. Nothing is really a required story element. It's all about execution. But this is not required in lots of popular franchises. You have characters like James Bond or Sherlock Holmes or Indiana Jones. These characters don't grow, nor do we need them to grow. We need them to act and be competent. I did another video on the competent man and what that kind of character archetype is. When we watch James Bond, it's mostly to see the execution of an interesting plot, not to see James Bond become a better version of James Bond. In fact, that would be impossible over the course of all the movies. He's had so many movies. Is he going to be... How he would have achieved like transcendence at this point with all the character improvement that would have to happen in all of the different movies. So that's not really part of the story. It's just James Bond is James Bond, and he really doesn't grow much, if at all. And only in a couple movies is there any kind of growth, like maybe, I don't know, Quantum of Solace or something. I don't know. So there's not very many James Bond movies that have this element at all. Most of the time they don't. Same thing with, say, Indiana Jones. So if you want to have it, though, it can make a character be very endearing, and it can allow the audience to become very attached to the character. And there's a couple reasons for this. First of all, when you start the character, that character is usually going to be flawed in some way. That is, that character is going to have some deficiencies or some excesses that make the character not perfect and also get the character into trouble or prevent him from overcoming some obstacle. These things stand in the way of him actually accomplishing his goals as the protagonist. So usually you're going to see this with the protagonist. And so we see ourselves a little bit in the protagonist. We can identify with him. He might be an everyman kind of character that doesn't really have anything special about him. And of course, we tend to identify with him because we don't feel like there's a whole lot of special about us. Or he could be a character that's very competent in one area, but also has deficiencies in others. And through the course of a plot, you end up having one or more plot obstacles that stop the protagonist from progressing any further. And then the protagonist has to stop, do the personal growth, and figure out how to do the thing that they're not good at, and then they can overcome the obstacle and achieve their goal. So that's usually the way that the growth fits in with the plot. Now, to make the growth convincing, you need to have a character that has those deficiencies. This is one of the things where people are like, how do you make a flawed character? And I've probably not had the best responses to this in the past. But the truth is that everybody has flaws, and those flaws, for this purpose, for making a character grow, remember it's not required, is to have those flaws be either an excess or a deficiency in some important area. So if the character is foolhardy, then they're going to get themselves into trouble by rushing headlong into battle. And they're going to get captured, or something bad's going to happen to them that's going to check them. And then they have to take a step back, learn to be more cautious, and therefore be more moderated in their bravery. If the character is a coward, they need to become more brave. So they have to come to an obstacle where somebody maybe needs to be saved. And so that person really cares about that person, and they are forced to take the steps of action. They're forced to put themselves in harm's way. They're forced to do something which is going to maybe cause them pain or risk their life. And then through that growth of bravery, they're able to get what they want. You know, they get the girl's attention, or they accomplish more of the plot goal, that sort of thing. So whatever the excess or the deficiency of, the growth is the moderation of that, not the opposite. You can do that, but then they have to eventually, we want them to go back to the middle to be moderated. So if they're a coward, we want them to gain bravery. If they're foolhardy, if they are a coward and then they go to foolhardy, the foolhardiness needs to have a consequence. Then they have to go back to being moderate and having an appropriate understanding of caution. Likewise, if they're naive and don't understand the nature of the world, they can't become completely jaded. If they become completely jaded or cynical, we want them to go back to somewhere in the middle. So if you overshoot that and then they have an excess in the other area, you can do that, but then the audience is wanting them to go back and have faith again in humanity or something like that. So a naive character needs to become worldly. A jaded character needs to have something to believe in. And you can have multiple things like this happen in one character, or you can just have one of them. I think one of the big mistakes a lot of novice writers make is they tend to come up with a flaw that is not a flaw in personality, but rather some sort of significant moral problem with them that makes them not very likable, and also generally makes them what we would consider like not a good person, like a bad person. So one of the things that they tend to give characters, and I notice that this is nothing specifically against people who are more on the left, but people who are politically left tend to make characters who are addicts all the time. I don't know why that is, but they are like, well, they're going to make a character who's a protagonist, but then they give them an addiction problem. They just kind of like slap that onto them, like this person has to self-medicate for some reason, and they don't really think anything deeper about that. A substance abuse problem is really from a different personality defect. You can't just slap substance abuse on an otherwise well-adjusted person. It doesn't work. And I remember reading these books by Guillermo del Toro and someone else. It's the Strain trilogy. It's these vampire books. And the main character is an addict for no reason. He doesn't have some traumatic past he's having to self-medicate from. He just is an addict because they wanted to give him something that made him less competent. They didn't want to have a competent man. He should have just been a competent man. But the addiction doesn't really serve any purpose, nor is it drawn from anything. Rather, people who have substance abuse problems tend to have a problem with gluttony. That is, they seek too much pleasure. They're out there trying to fill a spiritual hole with lots of pleasure rather than trying to self-medicate away pain. That might be part of it too. But usually the personal defect is like a lack of inhibition and things like that. So that somebody has to learn to moderate, not use the substances. That's what we want to see them do. We want to see them become a little bit more stoic and have a little bit more control and not be quite as gluttonous. Likewise, if somebody is too stoic and maybe completely self-deprecating, we kind of want them to come back into live a little. We want them to enjoy life a little bit. So if you have a character that's just like an accountant, that's all he does is work and he's very boring, we want him to be more interesting. We want him to take his glasses off and have a drink, So that's character growth that can happen in the opposite side too. So anyway, don't just slap something like addiction on the person or, some other more, like making them a kleptomaniac, right? So kleptomania is going to be derived from some other character defect for the purposes of story. It can be expressed through that, but generally you don't want to give characters, you don't want to slap things on characters that make them unlikable to the audience. So making them a kleptomaniac or an addict can really make them very unlikable to the audience. So I suggest you avoid that if you're trying to get the audience to really like your character. It's different if you're trying to write a story that's specifically about something like that, like addiction, then obviously you need to do it. But don't just slap it on in a vampire book. It's like, let's have a fantasy vampire book. We need a flaw for the main character. Rather than thinking of a personality flaw like, seeks too much pleasure, let's just make him an alcoholic and drug addict. Okay, sounds good, because we're alcoholics and drug addicts, so why not? So don't do that. Generally, you want to have a deficiency go back to that moderation level. We can look at a couple good examples, right? You have, we can look at Star Wars. So you have Luke Skywalker. He's very naive. He's also very foolhardy. He comes across many obstacles which force him to be both more cautious and to have a better, more accurate understanding of the world, not just be able to run blindly into danger and expect to get out on the other side. In fact, he gets his hand chopped off because he's not willing to be calm and to wait and to deal with the consequences of what bad people are doing without running headlong into it. He suffers a major defeat as a result of that. You also have a character like Han Solo. Even though he's not the protagonist, Han Solo is a major character, and he's a character that has one of these great growth arcs about removing a deficiency. So when you meet him, he is, rather than being naive, he's on the other side. And that's why him and Luke are arguing at first. He thinks Luke is this naive guy. He's cynical. He doesn't care about the Empire. He doesn't think the Empire's evil. He doesn't think the rebellion's evil. He's he's cynical about the whole thing. And at the end of the first film, he comes towards the center. He believes again. He believes in good and evil once again. That's part of his redemption and growth arc. Likewise, he's very arrogant, and he becomes more, shall we say, humble as time goes on. And he also gets better at what he's doing. So by the time you get to him in the third movie, you really like him because he's corrected most of his deficiencies. Luke has corrected most of his deficiencies. What deficiencies Leia had as kind of a goody two-shoes character get corrected as well. We're seeing the characters in the third movie fully developed, having done their growth and ready to overcome the final challenges of the entire trilogy. So that's a really good example. But people tend to look at that and think you have to have it in every story. You actually don't. You don't have to have that in every story. But if you have a young protagonist in particular, a boy or a young man or a young girl, young woman, character growth is a really easy thing to add and something that's very appropriate to add, because that's the time period in people's lives where they do lots of growing. But I think it's a good idea to also give every character that maybe has a deficiency or an excess in some area some other thing that makes them very endearing to the audience. They have to be caring. They have to be, they have to have something about them that the audience makes them be on their side to root for them. So Han Solo is kind of a masculine badass. You like him just for that reason. And so we're on the side of him, even though he's basically a brigand and a thief, a smuggler. And we're on the side of him, wanting him to grow into something that's better. And when he does that, that's a very satisfying kind of growth arc that we get to see. So anyway, there's a good example. And in general, that's how character growth happens. You may have a character like, if we look at Berserk. Berserk's a great example, because you have a character who is foolhardy. And he's foolhardy to the point where he really barely cares whether he lives or dies. All he cares about is the fight itself. And through the process of making friends, he's a completely lone wolf when we meet him. Through the process of making friends, he goes from a person who's, I don't care about anybody, to actually caring about people, and that causes him to go back towards where he should be, where he's no longer, I care nothing about my life, going back towards, these are people I care about. I don't want to rush headlong into battle. I care about living. I care about being with Casca. I care about my friends surviving. And then he goes through another trauma and becomes even more on the other side of like being Berserk. And again, has to be brought back towards that mitigating center by caring about other people. So Guts' growth arc is about going from a lone wolf who cares about nobody but himself and doesn't even care about his own existence, to somebody who cares about his own existence because he cares about other people. So another great example from media. So thanks so much, guys. Leave me your comments down below of some good character growth arcs that you see, as well as some that just maybe aren't really necessary. When I see these things fail, it becomes annoying. I'll give you a quick example of a failure, which is Neon Genesis Evangelion, and I'll do a larger video on this later. But what you have is a main character who starts off rather cowardly, and he does have character growth for a while, but then just gets pushed back into complete collapse towards the whole second half of the series in the movie. So it's unsatisfying to see that, and he becomes a character that is too pathetic for people to really, for me at least, to really like. But the initial growth, it's there, and then they kind of turn everything around on you. So that's an example of where something would fail, is that you don't have you set up the character with some kind of flaw, then you don't correct it. The character just gets worse. You can get somebody on the side of the character with pathos that's making them a little bit pathetic. You care about the person because they're not a great person, they're not showing a lot of virtue, but you want to see them show the virtue as time goes on. That almost goes that way, and then it goes backwards. So there's an example that I think was a miss. So thanks so much, and I'll see you guys next time.